Jake Morrison stood on his front porch, watching the sun disappear behind the rolling hills of his 3,000-acre cattle ranch. At 42, he had calloused hands, weathered skin, and eyes that held the quiet strength of a man who had learned to depend only on himself. The Montana sky stretched endlessly above him, painted in shades of orange and purple that most people would call beautiful. But Jake barely noticed anymore. Beauty was a luxury he couldn't afford when there were 500 head of cattle to manage, fences to mend, and a ranch that demanded every ounce of his attention. His father had built this ranch from nothing, starting with 40 acres and a dream bigger than his bank account. Jake inherited not just the land, but the crushing responsibility that came with it. For 15 years, he had worked sunrise to sunset 7 days a week, watching his ranch grow into one of the most successful operations in Gallatin County. But success came at a price. While his neighbors married, raised families, and built communities, Jake chose isolation. Relationships required time and emotional energy he simply didn't have. The house behind him stood as a testament to his solitary existence. Built to accommodate a family of 8, it now echoed with the footsteps of one lonely man. The kitchen table could seat 12, but Jake ate his meals standing at the counter, usually something quick and forgettable. The master bedroom remained untouched except for his side of the bed. Guest rooms gathered dust while the family room served as his office, covered with ledgers, cattle records, and feed supplier catalogs. Jake's only companion was Rex, a 7-year-old border collie whose intelligence and loyalty made him worth 3 hired hands. Rex understood Jake's whistles and hand signals better than most people understood spoken words. Together, they worked the ranch with a precision that came from years of partnership. But even Rex couldn't fill the growing emptiness that settled in Jake's chest during the long winter evenings. The nearest neighbor lived 12 miles away, and the closest town, Willow Creek, had a population of 800 people who all knew everyone else's business. Jake made his monthly trips to town for supplies, banking, and the occasional beer at Murphy's Tavern. He spoke when spoken to, conducted his business efficiently, and returned to his ranch as quickly as possible. The townspeople respected him but kept their distance. They understood that Jake Morrison was not a man who welcomed casual conversation or unsolicited friendship. This pattern continued unchanged until the spring day when Jake's world shifted in a way he never anticipated. He was repairing a section of fence near the main road when a dust cloud appeared on the horizon. A blue pickup truck, older and more battered than his own, pulled into his driveway. Jake watched with curious detachment as a woman climbed out of the driver's seat. Sarah Beth Henderson was 34 years old, though the harsh lines around her eyes made her appear older. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore faded jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. She walked with the determined stride of someone accustomed to handling difficult situations. Behind her, 2 children emerged from the truck. The boy looked about 10, thin and serious beyond his years. The girl couldn't have been more than 7, with pigtails and a dress that had been mended in several places. Jake approached them cautiously, Rex trotting beside him with alert ears and watchful eyes. Sarah Beth extended her hand with the confidence of someone conducting important business. Her grip was firm and calloused, the handshake of someone who understood hard work. Sarah Beth explained her situation with the straightforward honesty of someone who had run out of other options. She was recently widowed, left with 2 children and debts that exceeded her late husband's life insurance policy. Her husband had been a dreamer and a gambler, good with promises but poor with planning. He had invested their savings in a business venture that collapsed 6 months before his sudden heart attack, leaving Sarah Beth with nothing but responsibility and determination. She had heard through mutual acquaintances that Jake Morrison was looking for someone to help manage his household. The truth was more complicated than she realized. Jake had mentioned to his lawyer during a routine meeting that he was tired of eating his own terrible cooking and living in a house that felt more like a neglected warehouse than a home. The lawyer, who happened to be Sarah Beth's late husband's cousin, had made the connection that brought her to Jake's doorstep. Jake studied the woman and her children with the same careful attention he gave to evaluating livestock. Sarah Beth met his gaze without flinching, though he noticed her hands trembling slightly. The children stood close to their mother, the boy's arm protectively around his sister's shoulders. They were clean and well-dressed despite their obvious poverty, evidence of a mother who maintained standards even in desperate circumstances. The conversation that followed was pragmatic rather than romantic. Sarah Beth needed security and a home for her children. Jake needed someone to manage his household, prepare meals, and handle the domestic responsibilities that he had neglected for years. Neither spoke of love or companionship. This was a business arrangement, beneficial to both parties and honest in its limitations. Jake offered them the guest house, a smaller building on the property that had once housed his ranch foreman. It had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a living area that would provide the family with privacy and independence. In exchange for room, board, and a modest salary, Sarah Beth would handle the cooking, cleaning, and general household management for the main house. The children would attend the local school, and Jake would cover the associated expenses. Sarah Beth accepted immediately, though Jake noticed relief flooding her features like water breaking through a dam. They shook hands again to seal the agreement, and Jake helped them unload their belongings from the truck. Everything they owned fit into 6 cardboard boxes and 3 suitcases, a stark reminder of how completely their previous life had disappeared. The first weeks of this new arrangement unfolded with careful politeness and mutual respect. Sarah Beth proved to be an excellent housekeeper and cook, transforming Jake's neglected home into something approaching comfortable. She prepared substantial meals that went beyond his usual diet of canned soup and sandwiches. The house began to smell like baking bread and simmering stew instead of dust and loneliness. The children, Tommy and Emma, adapted to ranch life with the resilience that comes naturally to the young. Tommy showed immediate interest in the cattle and horses, following Jake around when school allowed and asking endless questions about ranch operations. Emma was more reserved, content to help her mother in the kitchen or play quietly in the yard under Rex's watchful protection. Jake found himself enjoying Tommy's curiosity and enthusiasm. The boy had never lived anywhere but the city, and everything about ranch life fascinated him. Jake began teaching him basic skills like reading cattle brands, identifying different grass types, and understanding weather patterns. Tommy absorbed these lessons eagerly, and Jake discovered that he enjoyed sharing his knowledge with someone who appreciated its value. Emma remained more distant, though Jake noticed she watched him carefully when she thought he wasn't looking. She had her father's eyes, Sarah Beth told him one evening, and her father's cautious nature around strangers. Jake understood caution. He had been cautious his entire adult life. As spring turned to summer, the arrangement settled into a comfortable routine. Sarah Beth managed the household with quiet efficiency, creating order and comfort without disrupting Jake's established patterns. She learned his preferences quickly and adapted her cooking to his tastes, while introducing variety he had never experienced. The children helped with age-appropriate chores and gradually became part of the ranch's daily rhythm. Jake began eating his meals at the kitchen table instead of standing at the counter. Initially, this happened because Sarah Beth insisted on serving proper meals at proper times. But gradually, he found himself looking forward to these shared moments. Tommy would recount his day at school or share something new he had learned about ranch work. Emma would quietly eat her food while drawing pictures on napkins or humming songs under her breath. Sarah Beth would discuss household matters or share observations about ranch operations that proved surprisingly insightful. These dinner conversations represented the closest thing to family life that Jake had experienced since his parents' death 15 years earlier. He began to understand what he had been missing during all those solitary years. The house felt alive again, filled with voices and laughter and the comfortable chaos that comes with children. But Jake also noticed things about Sarah Beth that troubled him. She worked constantly, from early morning until late evening, as if rest were a luxury she couldn't afford. She rarely spoke about her late husband or their previous life, changing the subject whenever personal topics arose. At night, he sometimes heard her crying quietly in the guest house. Soft sounds that carried across the yard on the wind. The children never mentioned their father, which struck Jake as unnatural for youngsters who had lost a parent only months earlier. When Tommy asked questions about ranching, he displayed knowledge that seemed beyond his years, as if he had been forced to mature quickly. Emma's quietness went deeper than shyness, suggesting experiences that had taught her to be invisible when adults were upset or stressed. Jake began to piece together a picture of their previous life that Sarah Beth had not shared. Her late husband had probably been more than just a poor businessman. The children's behavior suggested they had lived with uncertainty and possibly conflict. Sarah Beth's constant work ethic indicated someone accustomed to carrying more than her share of responsibility. Despite these observations, Jake maintained the professional distance that their arrangement required. He was not a man given to prying into other people's business, and Sarah Beth had made it clear that their relationship was strictly practical. She performed her duties admirably, and he respected the boundaries she had established. Summer brought the busy season of hay cutting, cattle rotation, and preparation for fall roundup. Jake worked longer hours, sometimes not returning to the house until after dark. Sarah Beth adapted by keeping his dinner warm and leaving it covered on the stove when late nights kept him in the fields. She never complained about the irregular schedule or the additional work that his extended hours created. One evening in late July, Jake returned home to find Sarah Beth waiting on the front porch with a glass of iced tea and a worried expression. Tommy had been helping one of the hired hands repair a gate when the boy accidentally spooked a bull. The massive animal had charged, and only quick action by the ranch hand had prevented serious injury. Tommy was physically unharmed but badly shaken by the incident. Jake found the boy sitting in the guest house kitchen, pale and quiet, while Emma patted his shoulder with the solemnity of someone twice her age. Sarah Beth hovered nearby, her anxiety evident despite her attempts to appear calm. Jake sat down across from Tommy and began talking about fear and ranch work, sharing stories of his own mistakes and close calls when he was learning the business. He explained that fear was a natural response to danger and that good ranch hands learned to respect that fear while not allowing it to prevent them from doing necessary work. Tommy listened intently, his color gradually returning as Jake spoke. By the end of their conversation, the boy was asking when he could help with the cattle again, though Jake noticed Sarah Beth's sharp intake of breath at the suggestion. That night, after the children were asleep, Sarah Beth knocked on Jake's door. She stood on his front porch in her nightgown and robe, her hair loose around her shoulders and her eyes bright with unshed tears. For the first time since her arrival, she allowed her careful composure to slip, revealing the worried mother beneath the competent housekeeper. She thanked Jake for his kindness to Tommy, explaining that her son had never had a positive male role model. Her late husband had been unpredictable and often absent, leaving Tommy to feel responsible for protecting his mother and sister. Jake's patient teaching and steady presence meant more to the boy than Sarah Beth could express. The conversation that followed revealed more about their previous life than Sarah Beth had shared in the 3 months since their arrival. Her husband had struggled with gambling addiction and periods of depression that made him unreliable as a provider and father. The family had moved frequently, always staying one step ahead of creditors or seeking new opportunities that never materialized. The children had learned to be quiet, adaptable, and self-sufficient, because their father's mood swings made their home environment unpredictable. Jake listened without judgment, understanding now why Tommy asked so many questions about ranch operations and why Emma seemed older than her 7 years. These children had been forced to grow up quickly, and Sarah Beth had carried the burden of protecting them while maintaining hope for their future. As Sarah Beth spoke, Jake found himself studying her face in the porch light. Without the worried lines that usually creased her forehead, she looked younger and more vulnerable. Her hair caught the light, revealing red highlights he had never noticed before. When she smiled, describing Tommy's excitement about learning to rope, her entire face transformed. For the first time since their arrangement began, Jake began to see Sarah Beth as something more than an employee. She was an intelligent, capable woman who had survived circumstances that would have broken many people. Her strength impressed him, but her vulnerability touched something deeper that he had thought permanently closed. The conversation ended with both of them acknowledging the growing bond between their small family unit. Jake promised to continue teaching Tommy about ranch work while being mindful of safety concerns. Sarah Beth promised to trust Jake's judgment and allow her son the independence he needed to develop confidence and skills. As August arrived, Jake found himself spending more time around the house than strictly necessary. He would linger over breakfast, listening to Sarah Beth discuss her plans for the day or share observations about the children's progress in school. He began joining them for lunch when his work schedule permitted, contributing to conversations that had nothing to do with ranch business. The evening meals became the highlight of Jake's day. The four of them would gather around the kitchen table, sharing food and stories while Rex dozed nearby. Tommy would recount his latest adventures, usually involving some aspect of ranch work that had captured his imagination. Emma had gradually begun speaking more freely, revealing a quick wit and artistic talent that she expressed through drawings and stories. Sarah Beth relaxed during these family dinners, laughing at her children's antics and contributing observations that made Jake see familiar aspects of ranch life from new perspectives. Her laughter was musical, and Jake found himself saying things specifically to provoke that sound. He began to understand that he had been living in silence for so long that he had forgotten the pleasure of shared conversation and genuine companionship. One evening, as they finished dinner and prepared to clear the table, Emma presented Jake with a drawing she had made at school. The picture showed the ranch house with 4 stick figures standing in front of it, labeled Mr. Jake, Mommy, Tommy, and Emma. Rex was included as a black scribble with a wagging tail, positioned protectively near the family group. Jake studied the drawing with the seriousness it deserved, noting how Emma had drawn all 4 figures holding hands and smiling. In a child's simple interpretation, they had become a family unit rather than a business arrangement. The realization struck him with unexpected force, making him understand that somewhere during the past months, these 3 people had become more important to him than he had allowed himself to acknowledge. Sarah Beth noticed his reaction to the drawing and quickly apologized, suggesting that Emma had misunderstood their living situation. But Jake carefully folded the picture and placed it in his shirt pocket, telling Emma that it was the finest artwork he had ever received and that he would treasure it always. That night, Jake lay awake thinking about the changes that had occurred in his life since Sarah Beth and her children's arrival. His house felt like a home again, filled with warmth and laughter and the comfortable chaos of family life. His meals were prepared with care and creativity that made him look forward to each one. His evenings were spent in conversation and companionship instead of solitary silence. More significantly, he had discovered that he enjoyed being needed for more than just his ability to provide shelter and employment. Tommy looked up to him with the admiration of a son for a father figure. Emma had begun seeking his approval for her drawings and school projects. Sarah Beth relied on his judgment and valued his opinions about matters beyond ranch operations. But Jake also recognized the dangerous territory his thoughts were entering. Their arrangement was supposed to be temporary and practical, lasting only until Sarah Beth could establish financial independence and find permanent housing for her family. She had been clear about the boundaries of their relationship from the beginning, and he had agreed to respect those limitations. The problem was that Jake's feelings had evolved beyond the simple gratitude and respect that their arrangement required. He found himself thinking about Sarah Beth throughout the day, looking forward to seeing her smile and hearing her voice. He had begun noticing details about her appearance and mannerisms that had nothing to do with her performance as his housekeeper. When she laughed at something Tommy said, Jake felt a warmth that had nothing to do with appreciation for her parenting skills. When she asked his advice about household matters, he enjoyed her trust and confidence in his judgment. When she worked in the kitchen, humming softly while she prepared meals, Jake found himself inventing reasons to be nearby just to listen to her contentment. These realizations troubled Jake because they represented a departure from the careful emotional control that had governed his life for 15 years. He had built his world around independence and self-reliance, avoiding the complications and vulnerabilities that came with caring deeply about other people. But Sarah Beth and her children had somehow bypassed his defenses, creating connections that felt both wonderful and terrifying. As summer drew to a close and the children prepared to return to school, Jake found himself dreading the approaching changes that autumn would bring. Sarah Beth had been carefully saving her salary and researching rental properties in town. She had mentioned several times her intention to find independent housing once she had accumulated enough money for deposits and first month's rent on an apartment. The thought of returning to his previous solitary existence filled Jake with a loneliness that surprised him with its intensity. He had lived alone for 15 years without feeling the emptiness that now seemed to permeate every corner of his house when he imagined it without Sarah Beth and her children. But Jake also recognized that his growing feelings created an impossible situation. Sarah Beth had made their arrangement out of necessity, not choice. She needed security for her children and time to rebuild her life after the devastating losses she had experienced. The last thing she needed was her employer developing romantic feelings that could complicate their practical arrangement. So Jake maintained the careful distance that their relationship required while struggling with emotions that grew stronger each day. He continued teaching Tommy about ranch work and appreciating Emma's artistic efforts while fighting the urge to tell Sarah Beth that he was beginning to fall in love with her strength, her kindness, and the way she had transformed his house into a home. The arrangement that had begun as a practical solution to mutual needs was becoming something far more complex and emotionally challenging than either of them had anticipated. As autumn approached, Jake faced the growing realization that what had started as a business relationship was evolving into something that would force both of them to confront feelings they had not expected and decisions that would change their lives forever. The first frost arrived early that October, coating the pastures with silver crystals that sparkled in the morning sun. Jake stood at his kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, watching Sarah Beth walk toward the main house with Emma's lunchbox that the girl had forgotten in the guest house. The sight had become so familiar that Jake automatically moved to open the door before she knocked, but this morning something felt different. Sarah Beth's steps seemed heavier, and when she handed him the lunchbox, their fingers brushed in a way that sent electricity through Jake's entire body. Sarah Beth felt it too. Jake saw the slight widening of her eyes and the pink flush that colored her cheeks before she quickly stepped back and began discussing plans for preserving the vegetables from her garden. But the moment lingered between them, unspoken acknowledgement that their carefully maintained professional relationship was becoming something neither could easily define or control. Tommy burst through the kitchen door at that moment, breathless with excitement about helping Jake move the cattle to their winter pastures. The boy had grown 3 inches since arriving at the ranch, and his city pallor had been replaced by the healthy tan of someone who spent his days outdoors. He spoke with newfound confidence about ranch operations, using terminology that demonstrated how much he had absorbed during his months of working alongside Jake. Emma followed more quietly, as was her nature, but she too showed the positive effects of their stable life. Her artwork had evolved from simple stick figures to detailed drawings that captured the beauty of ranch life with surprising accuracy. She had started writing stories about Rex's adventures and sharing them with anyone willing to listen. Her teacher had commented to Sarah Beth that Emma displayed exceptional creativity and intelligence that was finally being allowed to flourish. Jake watched Sarah Beth observe her children's transformation with pride and relief that made her radiant. The worry lines that had marked her face when she arrived had softened, and she moved with the confidence of someone who no longer carried the weight of constant uncertainty. She had gained weight in all the right places, her body losing the sharp angles of stress and malnutrition that had defined her appearance 6 months earlier. But Jake also noticed that Sarah Beth had been spending increasing amounts of time studying real estate listings and job opportunities in Willow Creek. She had inquired about positions at the bank, the grocery store, and even the small medical clinic that served the surrounding area. Her questions about rental properties had become more specific, focusing on places that would accommodate her children and fit within her anticipated budget. The knowledge that she was actively planning their departure filled Jake with a desperation he struggled to hide. Every shared meal felt precious because it might be one of their last. Every conversation with Tommy about ranch work carried the weight of lessons that might soon end. Every smile from Emma felt like a gift that would soon be withdrawn. Jake began finding excuses to extend their time together. He suggested that Tommy help with additional ranch tasks that would keep the boy busy after school. He encouraged Emma's artistic pursuits by providing her with better supplies and asking her to document different aspects of ranch life through her drawings. He consulted with Sarah Beth about household decisions that he could easily have made alone, valuing her input and extending their conversations whenever possible. The family dinners that had become the center of Jake's day took on heightened significance. He found himself memorizing details like the way Sarah Beth tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she was thinking, or how her laugh started as a quiet chuckle before building into something that filled the entire kitchen with warmth. He noticed how Tommy unconsciously adopted some of Jake's mannerisms and expressions, and how Emma had begun saving her best artwork specifically to show him. One evening in late October, as they finished dinner and prepared to clear the table, Sarah Beth announced that she had found a suitable apartment in town and would be giving Jake 2 weeks' notice. The rental was small but clean, with 2 bedrooms and enough space for her children to continue their schooling without changing districts. Her savings had grown sufficient to cover the security deposit and first month's rent, and she had received a provisional job offer from the local bank. The silence that followed her announcement was heavy with unspoken emotions. Tommy's face fell, and he began protesting that he didn't want to leave the ranch and his responsibilities with the cattle. Emma stopped drawing and looked between her mother and Jake with the wisdom of a child who understood that important things were being decided. Jake forced himself to congratulate Sarah Beth on her independence and success, while his heart hammered against his ribs. He praised her financial responsibility and assured her that she would excel in whatever position she accepted. But inside, he felt like a man watching his life drain away through a wound he couldn't treat. Sarah Beth thanked Jake for his kindness and support, explaining how much their time at the ranch had meant to her and her children. She spoke about the stability and security he had provided during their most difficult period, and how his patience with Tommy and Emma had given them confidence and skills they would carry forever. Her voice remained steady and professional, but Jake noticed her hands shaking as she folded the napkins. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He walked through his house, remembering how empty and sterile it had felt before Sarah Beth's arrival. The kitchen where they shared their meals would return to being a place where he grabbed quick, unforgettable food. The living room where Emma displayed her artwork would become his office again, covered with ledgers and business documents instead of children's creativity. The sounds of laughter and conversation that had filled the house would be replaced by the silence that had defined his existence for 15 years. Jake found himself standing in the guest house yard, looking at the windows where warm light spilled from Sarah Beth's home. He could see her moving around the kitchen, probably packing their belongings and preparing for their departure. The sight of her in domestic activity that no longer included him filled Jake with a longing so intense that it physically hurt. Rex appeared beside him, as if sensing his master's distress. Jake scratched the dog's ears and spoke softly about feelings he couldn't share with anyone else. He told Rex about falling in love with Sarah Beth's strength and kindness, about wanting to protect and cherish her and her children, about the fear that prevented him from expressing emotions that might complicate their lives. The following days passed with artificial normalcy that fooled no one. Sarah Beth maintained her efficient household management while quietly packing their belongings. Tommy continued his ranch work with Jake, but spoke frequently about missing the cattle and horses he had learned to care for. Emma created a series of drawings titled My Home that featured various scenes of ranch life with meticulous detail that suggested she was trying to preserve every memory. Jake attempted to maintain professional distance while battling the urge to ask Sarah Beth to reconsider her decision. He wanted to tell her that she and her children belonged at the ranch, that they had created the family life he had never known he wanted, that the thought of losing them felt like losing part of his soul. But he also recognized that Sarah Beth had worked hard to achieve independence, and asking her to abandon her plans would be selfish and unfair. The tension between them grew daily as unspoken feelings filled the space that polite conversation couldn't bridge. Jake noticed Sarah Beth watching him with an expression that suggested she was struggling with her own emotions. Their accidental physical contact became charged with electricity that neither acknowledged. Conversations about practical matters carried undercurrents of meaning that neither dared to address directly. One afternoon, while Tommy helped Jake repair a section of fencing, the boy asked with the directness that children possess whether Jake would miss them after they moved to town. Jake found himself unable to formulate a response that was both honest and appropriate for a 10-year-old. He settled for assuring Tommy that good friendships could continue regardless of distance, and that the skills the boy had learned would serve him well throughout his life. But Tommy persisted with questions that revealed how much he had come to love ranch life and regard Jake as a father figure. The boy spoke about wanting to be a rancher when he grew up, about missing the daily work with cattle and horses, about how different and small the apartment in town would feel after the freedom of ranch living. His words made clear that leaving was not his choice and that he understood the financial necessities that forced their departure. That evening, Emma presented Jake with a special drawing she had created as a goodbye gift. The picture showed the ranch house surrounded by all the animals and people who lived there, with herself and Tommy and their mother standing close to Jake. At the bottom, in her careful 7-year-old handwriting, she had written, "Thank you for being our family." The simplicity and sincerity of her gift nearly broke Jake's composure entirely. Sarah Beth found Jake sitting on the front porch an hour later, still holding Emma's drawing and staring into the distance with an expression of profound loss. She sat beside him without speaking, and for several minutes they shared the comfortable silence that had developed between them over months of gradually deepening friendship. When Sarah Beth finally spoke, her voice was soft and uncertain in a way Jake had never heard before. She asked whether he was satisfied with their arrangement, and if he felt that she and her children had fulfilled their responsibilities adequately. The question surprised Jake because Sarah Beth's performance had exceeded every expectation from the beginning. Jake assured her that she had transformed his house into a home and his routine existence into something approaching happiness. He praised her children's behavior and adaptability, their contributions to ranch life, and the positive energy they had brought to his previously solitary world. He spoke with complete sincerity about how much their presence had meant to him, while carefully avoiding any suggestion that his feelings had evolved beyond gratitude and respect. Sarah Beth listened with growing emotion that she struggled to control. When Jake finished speaking, she was quiet for several moments before admitting that leaving the ranch felt like abandoning the first real security her children had ever known. She spoke about Tommy's love for ranch work and Emma's artistic flourishing, about how both children had thrived under Jake's patient guidance and steady presence. The conversation that followed revealed feelings that both had been suppressing for weeks. Sarah Beth admitted that she had come to value Jake's opinion and support more than mere professional courtesy required. She spoke about feeling safe for the first time in years, about not having to worry constantly about providing for her children or protecting them from instability and uncertainty. Jake found himself sharing emotions he had never expected to feel, much less express. He talked about the loneliness that had defined his life before their arrival and how much he had come to treasure their daily interactions. He spoke about watching Tommy develop confidence and skills, about Emma's artistic gifts bringing beauty and creativity to his previously stark existence, about Sarah Beth's strength and grace inspiring admiration that had grown into something much deeper. As they talked, both began to acknowledge the possibility that their arrangement had evolved beyond its original practical boundaries. The children had found stability and security that extended far beyond basic housing and food. Jake had discovered that solitude and independence were poor substitutes for love and companionship. Sarah Beth had realized that true partnership with a good man might be possible even after the devastating betrayal of her first marriage. But acknowledging these feelings also meant confronting the practical obstacles that made acting on them seem impossible. Sarah Beth was still technically Jake's employee, dependent on his generosity for her children's welfare. The power imbalance in their relationship made genuine romantic partnership seem inappropriate and potentially exploitative. Her recent widowhood and financial desperation created additional complications that neither could easily navigate. Jake was also intimidated by the prospect of instant fatherhood to two children who deserved stability and commitment rather than the uncertain experiment of a man learning to love for the first time at 42. He had no experience with family life or parenting responsibilities, and the possibility of failing Sarah Beth's children terrified him more than any physical danger he had faced on the ranch. Their conversation ended without resolution, but with mutual recognition that their feelings had grown beyond what their original arrangement could contain. They parted that evening with the understanding that important decisions lay ahead and that the next few days would determine whether their relationship could evolve into something permanent and genuine, or whether Sarah Beth would proceed with her plans for independence. Jake spent that night walking his property and thinking about the choices before him. He could maintain the status quo, allowing Sarah Beth to leave as planned and returning to his previous solitary existence with memories of the brief period when his house felt like a home. Or he could risk everything by expressing his true feelings and asking her to consider a future that neither had planned, but both had begun to want. The decision would require courage that Jake wasn't certain he possessed. Loving someone meant accepting vulnerability and the possibility of loss. It meant sharing his life, his decisions, and his future with people whose needs and feelings would become as important as his own. It meant abandoning the protective isolation that had defined his adult life in favor of the messy, complicated, wonderful reality of family relationships. But as Jake considered the alternative of losing Sarah Beth and her children, the risk of vulnerability seemed preferable to the certainty of regret. He had spent 15 years protecting himself from emotional pain, but in doing so, he had also protected himself from emotional fulfillment. The months with Sarah Beth and her children had shown him what his life could be if he found the courage to open his heart to love and commitment. The following morning, Jake made his decision. He would tell Sarah Beth about his feelings and ask her to consider staying not as his employee, but as his partner in life. He would offer to adopt her children legally, giving them the security and belonging they deserved. He would ask her to marry him, not from loneliness or convenience, but from genuine love and desire to build a life together. The conversation he planned would be the most important of his life, with stakes that included not just his future happiness, but the welfare of two children who had come to trust and depend on him. Jake knew that Sarah Beth might refuse his proposal, choosing independence over a relationship that had grown from practical necessity. But he also knew that failing to express his feelings would mean losing the best thing that had ever happened to him without even attempting to fight for it. As he prepared for work that morning, Jake rehearsed the words he would use to tell Sarah Beth that somewhere between hiring her as his housekeeper and watching her transform his house into a home, he had fallen completely and permanently in love with her. The speech felt inadequate for emotions that seemed too large for language, but he hoped that his sincerity would communicate what his words couldn't fully express. The day ahead would determine whether Jake's carefully ordered, solitary life would return to its previous patterns or evolve into something he had never dared to imagine. Either way, he would finally stop hiding from the truth of his feelings and take the risk that love required. The outcome remained uncertain, but Jake had finally found the courage to reach for happiness rather than settling for mere survival. Jake spent the entire morning rehearsing his speech while repairing fence posts, but when lunchtime arrived, his carefully planned words disappeared like smoke in the wind. Sarah Beth had prepared his favorite meal, pot roast with vegetables from her garden, and the familiar domestic scene felt too precious to disrupt with declarations of love that might change everything forever. Instead, he ate in thoughtful silence, while Tommy chattered about a hawk he had seen circling the south pasture, and Emma showed him her latest drawing of Rex chasing a butterfly. The afternoon brought no better opportunity. Sarah Beth spent her time organizing their belongings and making final arrangements for their move, which was scheduled for the following weekend. Jake found himself inventing unnecessary tasks that kept him near the house, hoping for a moment when they could speak privately without the children present. But Sarah Beth seemed to be avoiding such moments, perhaps sensing the conversation that was building between them and fearing its implications. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, Jake finally found the courage to knock on the guest house door. Sarah Beth answered wearing a simple blue dress that he had never seen before, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of tied back in its usual practical ponytail. She looked beautiful and nervous, as if she too had been preparing for an important conversation. They walked to the front porch of the main house without speaking, both understanding that this might be their last opportunity for honest communication before her departure. The October air was crisp and clear, with stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Rex settled at their feet, sensing the serious nature of the moment and providing his quiet, steady presence. Jake began by thanking Sarah Beth for everything she had brought to his life over the past 6 months. He spoke about the transformation of his house from a place where he merely existed into a home filled with warmth and laughter. He described watching her children flourish under the stability and security that ranch life had provided, and how their happiness had become as important to him as his own. Sarah Beth listened without interruption, her expression growing more emotional as Jake continued. When he finally paused, she spoke about her own transformation during their time at the ranch. She talked about feeling safe for the first time in years, about not having to worry constantly about money or her children's welfare. She described watching Tommy develop confidence and skills under Jake's patient teaching, and how Emma had blossomed creatively in an environment that encouraged rather than discouraged her artistic nature. The conversation gradually moved from gratitude to acknowledgement of deeper feelings that had developed between them. Sarah Beth admitted that leaving the ranch felt like leaving home, and that the apartment in town represented security, but not happiness. She spoke about Jake's kindness and reliability, about how his steady presence had given her children the father figure they had never had. Jake found himself able to express emotions that he had kept buried for months. He told Sarah Beth about falling in love with her strength and grace, about admiring her devotion to her children and her determination to build a better life for them. He spoke about the loneliness that had defined his existence before their arrival and how empty his life would feel after their departure. When Jake finally asked Sarah Beth to marry him, the words came out simply and directly, without the elaborate speech he had rehearsed. He told her that he loved her and wanted to spend his life making her happy. He promised to be a devoted father to Tommy and Emma, to provide them with security and love and every opportunity for success. He asked her to stay not as his employee, but as his partner, to help him transform his ranch into a legacy they could pass on to her children. Sarah Beth's response was immediate and emotional. Tears streamed down her face as she admitted that she had fallen in love with Jake, but had been afraid to acknowledge those feelings because of their complicated circumstances. She had convinced herself that her emotions were merely gratitude for his kindness and security, but she had come to understand that her feelings went far deeper than appreciation. She spoke about the fears that had prevented her from admitting her love. Her first marriage had been a disaster of broken promises and financial irresponsibility, leaving her afraid to trust another man with her heart and her children's future. Jake's proposal represented everything she wanted but had never dared to hope for. A partner who was reliable and kind, a father who would cherish her children, a future built on genuine love rather than desperate necessity. The conversation that followed lasted until nearly midnight as they discussed the practical aspects of joining their lives permanently. Jake wanted to adopt Tommy and Emma legally, giving them his name and all the rights and security that came with legitimate fatherhood. He spoke about expanding the ranch operation to create a legacy that the children could inherit if they chose to continue ranching, or that could fund their education and future choices if they preferred other careers. Sarah Beth shared her dreams for their family's future, including improvements to the ranch house that would accommodate their growing family more comfortably. She spoke about the garden she wanted to expand and the guest rooms she envisioned for visits from friends and extended family. Her plans demonstrated that she had been thinking about their life together even while preparing to leave. They discussed the children's needs and how to help them adjust to their changed family status. Tommy would need reassurance that his new permanent home wouldn't be taken away and that Jake's commitment to him was genuine and lasting. Emma would need time to understand that her family was becoming something stable and permanent rather than another temporary arrangement that might disappear without warning. Jake and Sarah Beth also talked about their relationship and how it had evolved from practical arrangement to genuine love. They acknowledged the unusual circumstances that had brought them together, but agreed that the feelings they had developed were real and lasting. Sarah Beth admitted that she had been fighting her attraction to Jake for weeks, afraid that acting on her feelings would complicate their arrangement and potentially jeopardize her children's security. When they finally kissed, it was with the passion of two people who had been denying their feelings for far too long. The kiss was tender and desperate and full of promise for their future together. When they separated, both were crying with relief and joy and the overwhelming emotion of finally admitting truths they had been hiding from themselves and each other. The next morning brought the practical tasks of canceling Sarah Beth's apartment rental and withdrawing her job application from the bank. Jake contacted his lawyer to begin adoption proceedings for Tommy and Emma and to discuss the legal aspects of adding Sarah Beth and her children to his will and insurance policies. These administrative details felt wonderful rather than burdensome because they represented the building of their official family unit. Tommy and Emma reacted to the news of their mother's engagement with pure joy and excitement. Tommy immediately began asking when he could start calling Jake Dad and whether his last name would change to Morrison. Emma created a series of drawings showing their family engaged in various activities around the ranch, including a wedding scene with everyone dressed in their finest clothes and Rex wearing a bow tie. The children's enthusiasm confirmed that Jake's fears about instant fatherhood had been unnecessarily pessimistic. Tommy and Emma had already accepted him as their father figure during the months they had lived at the ranch. The legal and emotional formalities would simply acknowledge relationships that had already developed naturally through shared experiences and mutual affection. Jake and Sarah Beth decided to have a simple wedding at the ranch in December, after the adoption paperwork was completed and the children could officially take Jake's name. They would invite their few close friends and neighbors to celebrate in the house that had brought them together, and that would serve as the foundation for their married life. Sarah Beth threw herself into planning their wedding and preparing their home for their official life as a family. She selected paint colors that would make the house brighter and more welcoming, and she designed a family room where they could gather for evening activities. Jake supported all her plans enthusiastically, amazed at how much thought she had given to improving their home, even while preparing to leave it. The weeks leading up to their wedding passed quickly, filled with legal appointments, wedding preparations, and the joyful work of building their life together. Jake marveled at how seamlessly Sarah Beth and her children had integrated into his previously solitary existence. The ranch that had once felt empty and sterile now bustled with activity and conversation and laughter. Tommy's enthusiasm for ranch work had evolved into genuine skill and responsibility. Jake began teaching him more advanced aspects of cattle management and equipment maintenance, laying the groundwork for the boy to eventually take an active role in ranch operations. Emma's artistic talents continued to flourish, and Jake arranged for her to take art lessons in town that would nurture her creativity. Sarah Beth's domestic skills transformed their house into something that surpassed Jake's wildest dreams of what a home could be. She cooked elaborate meals that brought them together each evening for conversation and family time. She decorated with a mix of practical comfort and artistic beauty that reflected her personality and made every room inviting. She managed their household with efficiency that freed Jake to focus on ranch work while ensuring that family needs were always prioritized. But more than the practical improvements, Sarah Beth brought emotional richness to Jake's life that he had never imagined possible. Their conversations ranged from ranch business to dreams for their children's futures to intimate discussions about their growing love for each other. She challenged his thinking, supported his decisions, and contributed ideas that improved both their family life and ranch operations. The wedding took place on a clear December afternoon, with snow dusting the mountains in the distance. Sarah Beth wore a simple white dress that she had chosen specifically because it would be suitable for ranch life rather than relegated to storage after one wearing. Jake wore his best suit and a tie that Tommy had helped him select, declaring that his new father should look really fancy for such an important day. Tommy served as best man, standing proudly beside Jake and holding the rings with the seriousness of someone who understood the significance of the ceremony. Emma scattered flower petals down the makeshift aisle they had created in the living room, her artistic eye evident in the careful pattern she created with each step. The ceremony itself was simple but deeply meaningful. Jake and Sarah Beth exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising to love and support each other and to provide Tommy and Emma with the stable, loving home they deserved. When they were pronounced husband and wife, the applause from their small gathering of friends was enthusiastic and heartfelt. The celebration that followed was exactly what both Jake and Sarah Beth had wanted: intimate, joyful, and focused on the family they had created together. The children gave speeches that made everyone cry with their sincerity and happiness. Rex wore the bow tie that Emma had depicted in her wedding drawings, looking dignified despite his obvious confusion about the formal attire. As their wedding day ended and their guests departed, Jake found himself standing in the same spot where he had spent so many solitary evenings before Sarah Beth's arrival. But now he was surrounded by the sounds of his family preparing for bed. Tommy discussing plans for tomorrow's ranch work, Emma showing her mother a new drawing, Sarah Beth moving through their home with the comfortable efficiency of someone who belonged there completely. The transformation of Jake's life felt miraculous in its completeness. The ranch that had once been his refuge from the world had become the foundation for a family that included everything he had never known he wanted. Sarah Beth had brought not just her domestic skills and her children, but her strength, her love, and her vision for their future together. In the months that followed their wedding, their family continued to grow stronger and more unified. The adoption of Tommy and Emma was finalized in February, giving them the legal security and belonging they had never experienced. Both children thrived under the confidence that came with permanent family status, and their academic and social development reflected the stability of their home environment. Jake discovered that fatherhood came naturally to him, perhaps because he approached it with the same patience and dedication that had made him successful as a rancher. He found joy in teaching Tommy advanced skills and in encouraging Emma's artistic development. Most importantly, he provided both children with the consistent love and support that allowed them to heal from the insecurity of their early childhood. Sarah Beth flourished as Jake's wife and partner, contributing ideas and energy that improved every aspect of their life together. She managed their household with creativity and efficiency, while also becoming involved in ranch operations in ways that utilized her intelligence and business sense. Their marriage was built on mutual respect, shared goals, and genuine affection that deepened with each passing day. By the time their first anniversary arrived, Jake could barely remember the loneliness and emptiness that had defined his life before Sarah Beth and her children transformed his ranch into a home. The practical arrangement that had begun as a solution to mutual needs had evolved into a love story that exceeded every dream either of them had dared to imagine. Looking back, Jake understood that finding love had required him to abandon his protective isolation and take the risk of caring deeply about other people. Sarah Beth had taught him that vulnerability was the price of authentic connection, and that the rewards of love far exceeded the security of solitude. Together they had created a family that was stronger than either could have built alone, proving that sometimes the best things in life come from the courage to open your heart to unexpected possibilities. Their story became a testament to the power of love to transform ordinary circumstances into extraordinary happiness, and to the truth that real love often arrives not when we're searching for it, but when we're brave enough to recognize it and fight for it when it appears in our lives.